What's up, y'all? It's Zach with Living Corporate. And, we continue to live in really extraordinary times for some people. Frankly, these times have been this way for a while for many of us. But we have like this, seemingly to awareness and consciousness. And so I want to respect that. I want to respect where we are. And, we've actually shifted up our interview schedule. And we're having more and more pointed conversations about the reality of white supremacy. So you've probably noticed a few episodes, and we're going to continue to do that. I shared on Twitter a couple days ago that I think my baseline is just much angrier these days, and I'm at peace with that. And so with all that being said, we have conversations on Living Corporate that center marginalized voices at work. We do that by engaging thought leaders from across the spectrum to really have just authentic discussions. And today we have a phenomenal guest, just like we do every single week. But it makes it no less true that we have a great guest today, Dr. Tema Okun. Tema has spent many years working for the social justice community. For over 10 of those years, she worked in partnership with the late and beloved Kenneth Jones as part of the Change Work Training Group, and now facilitates long-term anti-racism, anti-oppression work as a member of the DR Works Collaborative. She is a skilled facilitator, bringing both an anti-racist lens and commitment to supporting personal growth and development within the context of institutional and community mission. She holds a BA from Oberlin College, a master's in adult education from NC State University, a degree Greensboro, and is on the faculty of the Educational Leadership Department at the National Louis University in Chicago. She is active in Middle East peace and justice work with Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions USA. Dr. Okun, how are you?
I'm great, and I want to apologize up front because some of those biographical facts are no longer true. I left the faculty of NLU several years ago, and I'm now active with Jewish Voice for Peace. Just to update everybody so that they don't think that you or I are lying about
Thank you. No, thank you for correcting me on that. Thank you. I appreciate that. So you've been in this work for quite a while. Like we talked, some months ago, actually, before my daughter was born, and
beautiful daughter.
Thank you very much. Yes, you've seen her. Yeah, she looks great. In fact, she's getting bigger every day. It's so cool that she's changing all the time. What I'd like to know though, if you've ever seen anti-racist, anti-state sanctioned violence protests like this in your lifetime, in terms of just scale and scope.
You gave me that question ahead of time, and I want to say both yes and no. And I want to say yes because I lived during the Vietnam War protest time period, and I lived during the AIDS protest time and the growth of the LGBTQ movement. And I do want to acknowledge that the grief and rage and resistance that we're seeing today is part of a longer legacy of people who have been full of grief and rage and resistance before us, so that we don't isolate ourselves, and we also take credit for this particular moment, which is unique in the sense of the reach, the brilliance, the clarity about the demands. I'm very excited about, the defund the police direction that this is taking, and so it's a yes and no answer. I'm so excited to be alive in this moment, and I feel like I was honored to live through those other moments as well.
And, it's interesting because it's easy to kind of forget about the history of protest or the history of activism work. And so then things kind of come in cycles. And so, new voices come up in new generations, and it's almost as if these conversations have never been had before. But I'd like to get your perspective on really just these concepts, like the concept of whiteness, and then also the concept of anti-racism. And I know those are big questions. I'm gonna give you space, but I'd love just to hear you talk about that.
Well, I think part of what's really unique about this moment is that these concepts are more broadly understood within the resistance movement that we're seeing now than they ever have been in my lifetime. So that part is definitely true. When I started doing this work a gazillion years ago, really 40 years ago or so, a lot of people, there was not the what I would call, I don't want to use the word sophisticated, so the deep understanding about how what whiteness is, how white supremacy operates, how white supremacy is the culture that we're swimming in, how it informs who we are, although it doesn't define who we are. There was not that clarity. And I feel like I've been part of the generations of people who've helped think about, develop, and I'm not taking credit for it. I'm part of the wave of people who
Sure.
understood that it was important to ground us in understanding that, understanding the ways that white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, all these systems of oppression have really shaped who we are, and we need to understand how they operate if we're going to do something different and have a different vision. What I'll say is that I think, this might be one of the questions you're going to ask later, but I think that the thing that we need to be careful about is that white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy are very, very ingenious. And what we've seen happen in every movement that has ever occurred historically in our country is that they get diverted from a justice focus to an access focus. And that capitalism and white supremacy know how to lure us just enough to say, we're going to let you have power of a certain extent in our institutions. We're going to let you have access. We're going to say good things about you.
Right.
But don't rock the boat too much. They're just going to defund the police. It's too vague. You don't have a plan. It's, when we talk about access to health care, people don't demand simplicity. It's like, yes, we have a vision. We have a vision of communities where the billions of dollars that are spent on militarized police are spent on schools and community centers and making sure people have enough food to eat. That's the vision that we have, calling that defund the police, and that's what we're going to do, and not get distracted by. So part of the backlash is going to be fierce and hateful and violent, but the more dangerous part of the backlash is going to be accommodation. It's
interesting to your point around respectability, right? And so how people use the concept of civility as a cudgel, right? To really stymie progression. We had Dr. Robin DiAngelo on Living Corporate a few months ago, and we talked about her work in studying white fragility. And, it was a great discussion, and but I've listened to perspectives on how white fragility is not necessarily, anti-racist work. Can you share your perspective on that?
Sure. One of the dangers of our movement, and I love our movement, and I love many things about it. One of the dangers of our movement, though, is that we can get really rich about what being in the movement or what activism is. And my feeling is that, so I'm 68 years old, I've been around a long time, and my point in my life is that we need it all. We need it all. This is not a competition about, who's doing it right and who's doing it best and and where the focus needs to be.
Yeah.
So our frame, the way that DR Works, the collaborative, has also been closed for about 3 or 4 years. All of our materials are on our website, which we can share the address later. But our frame is that diversity and racism show up on 3 levels: on the personal level, the ways that we are with each other and ourselves; on the cultural level, the beliefs and values and standards and norms of the groups of people that we're operating within, including sort of white supremacy culture overall; and then our procedures and practices of institutions. And one of our racial equity principles is that you have to work on all 3 levels. And so what I hear Robin saying, and I think it's really important, is that those of us who are white, we work pretty consistently on our conditioning, the constant invitation that we are extended to join whiteness, and in joining whiteness to both disconnect from people of color, disconnect from other white people, and disconnect from ourselves, because that's what the invitation is. An example of white fragility is if you are angry, if you are in full grief about what's happening, and my fragility says, well, you need to tone it down because I can't, I can only accept you if it comes to me in a certain kind of package.
Right.
Then we've completely disconnected. I've disconnected from you, and I've disconnected from myself because I'm not allowing myself to feel my own grief and rage, right? Because I'm so scared. I'm so scared of yours. I'm certainly not going to feel my own. So I think what you're speaking to, there's a thing that people say about white people and navel gazing, and we just we like to navel gaze, and what I like to, we like to agonize, and Maurice Mitchell talks about how his liberation or the liberation of black people, of people of color, is not tied up with my anxiety as a white person about getting it right. And so I think that there's this balance between all doing our personal work, because all of us have invitations extended to us by white supremacy in one form or another. So all of us doing work on our internalized stuff, and then continuing to be in the world in relationship with figuring out what our role in this in this resistance movement is. So it's not an either or. It's very much, to me, a both and. Because if we don't do our personal work, then the way that we're going to show up is just going to replicate all the dynamic and clinging to power for its own sake, not understanding who we're accountable to, and posturing, and just things that aren't helpful. So and fear of our fear and all of those things. So I think it's a both and very much.
I appreciate it. And I agree, right? I think, one, white fragility is just so real, and it creates so many barriers, and frankly, and causes so much harm in ways that we don't even consider, like literally every single day. And because white supremacy is such a reality, white fragility impacts behaviors of black and brown folks even when white people aren't around. So to make sure that those who are in power are examining and interrogating themselves, like that's critical. That's critical.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that it's the only thing, but it's important to do.
Yeah. I think that living in white skin and a white supremacy culture obviously confers power and privilege, but not to everyone and not in the same way, right? And so I think that it's really important for me, so I'm speaking for myself, I think it's really important to understand how many white people are caught up in the same crapola of white supremacy and the ways that racism targets people of color are caught up in that without they see it clearly. And I'm not saying that racism targets white people. I'm saying that white people who are working class and poor, or white people who have had no opportunity to understand how whiteness operates, are swimming around in ways that are completely not in their self-interest, and are continually encouraged, for example, to look to middle class and wealthy white people as their community, when in fact their community are other people in the same economic and social situation that they're in. So I just, I like to make sure that we understand how many white people are hoodwinked by this whole thing well, and invited to participate in ways that make no sense to them or anyone.
I think that's a really good point. One piece of literature that has really gotten, frankly, over the years, consistent attention, but in this time continues to get attention, is Supremacy Culture, something that you wrote. And, we'll put the link in the show notes for everybody, but we're going to walk through this research, this document. But before we do that, can you talk to us a little bit about how you arrived at the points that you made within the work that you wrote?
Sure. So I've only written one book, and it's called The Emperor Has No Clothes, Teaching About Race and Racism to People Who Don't Want to Know. And it basically was a chance for me to sit down and write all that I and other colleagues had learned about teaching about race and racism to people. So that's what that book is. And White Supremacy Culture was written before the book, and I wrote it either 90 or 99, so a long time ago. Kenneth and I were doing a lot of work on the West Coast, and I had just come from a People's Institute for Survival and Beyond workshop with Ron Chisholm and Daniel Buford and probably a few other people. And the People's Institute is based in New Orleans and is sort of, in my view, the granddaddy of people doing anti-racist education and training in my lifetime. And so were our mentors and people that we wrote the work that we were doing. And so I was full of their wisdom when I wrote the piece, and I also had, and I can't remember the meeting, but I had just come from a meeting of predominantly white people where pretty much every dynamic in that sheet of in that article showed up, and I was frustrated beyond belief. And people say this, and this is my only experience of this phenomena, which is that it wrote itself. Like I sat down on the computer, it wrote itself.
Wow.
And just sort of, this behavior. It was like I was in a fury. And then I showed it to my mentor, Sharon Martinez, who was running the Challenging White Supremacy workshops at the time in the Bay Area. And she said, you can't list the terrible behaviors. You have to list antidotes. You have to talk about what to do. And so that was such good advice. And so I added those into it. And I will say, so it was written a long time ago. It was written without a clear lens, which it needs. And it left some things out, and it didn't. So I'm actually, in this moment, my project is creating a website rather than another article, but a website based on the article so that it can be more flexible. Lots of people have used it and adapted it in ways that people have used it and adapted it. I'm going to add a class lens tell some stories, give examples. So that's my current project.
Can we talk about, like, because in this doc, you essentially have these different characteristics. I'd like to walk through the characteristics that you list and then really just have you just talk about each of them, because, and again, there are a lot of people that I respect. I'm going to shout out Dr. Oni Blackstock, because she's the most recent person who I saw tweeting about this and talking about this. And but it's all over YouTube. Like, I don't know if you know this. Like, it's literally, like, I just saw a YouTube where somebody put this document up on a video and then, like, slow scrolled it and talked about it. But I caught myself reading it and I was like, this is like exactly like every work culture I've ever been a part of. So let's do this. Let's do each characteristic, and you just kind of explain, how these attitudes and behavior, reinforce or drive white supremacy at work. Can we do that?
Sure, of course.
Okay. So you start off your first one is perfectionism.
Mm-hmm. Started with that one, I think, probably because that's the one I'm the most guilty of myself. So I talk about how white supremacy culture is, the purpose of white supremacy is to disconnect us from each other so that a few people can exert their cultural control in ways that allow them to profit at our expense. And so perfectionism is this idea, very, very connected to professionalism, and this idea that there is a perfect way to do something, which is completely nonsense, and that there's somebody or some group of people who can determine what that is and encourage you to aspire to it. Mm. And then we internalize that, and I don't think I know a single person who actually feels completely comfortable with who they are and how they show up and how they're doing things, because the culture is so adept at knowing we're continually falling short. And if we're continually falling short, then we have to buy products to make ourselves look better and feel better. And it's just a vicious cycle. And the other thing I'll say about this list is that these are things that are used to perpetuate racism and white supremacy and to target people of color in different ways at different times. They impact everybody, and they're toxic. There's nothing good about them at all at any time, unless you're the one trying to control other people, and then you're so disconnected from yourself. It's not even, Trump is a very good example of someone who's completely disconnected from anything. So I think that professionalism is used as a tool of professionalism and as a tool to keep people from positions of power, and also to keep people off balance about who they are and their worth and their value.
It's interesting. One of the things you say in here is, you say little appreciation expressed among people for the work that others are doing. Appreciation that is expressed usually directed to those who get most of the credit anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And the way that we internalize that, even when we're fighting hard not to.
Yeah.
It's like, I was talking to a friend yesterday who's applying for a position at a foundation. It's completely clear to me, and I think to her, that she's not only qualified for the job, she's overqualified for the job. And my guess is they won't hire her because it's clear to them too. And right. It's so pernicious. It's the way that works. It's like we're a lot of white people here who are not called to account for our lack of understanding about how racism and white supremacy operates, because it's not ever part of our job qualifications. No one is evaluating us based on our ability to understand how that works. And we're about to invite somebody in who does understand, and that makes us really uncomfortable. So maybe never, we need somebody who's going to not make us so uncomfortable all the time. That's part of how that works.
And so it's interesting. So I was about to move to sense of urgency, but to your point, and the recommended antidotes for racism, you have develop a culture of appreciation where the organization takes time to make sure that the people's work and efforts are appreciated. Develop a learning organization where it's expected that everyone will make mistakes, and those mistakes offer opportunities for learning. It's interesting, even in organizations where they will say things like, oh, it's okay to make mistakes. I've noticed that, and this is a common experience for most black folks at work, is black and brown people, to be clear.
Right.
We don't have the same grace to make mistakes.
No, you're not. That's right.
It's interesting because I've had this conversation already, but like I had the conversation with a colleague, but where, I think I put there was a time at work I put a PowerPoint together, and I think PowerPoints overall are have to be one of the biggest examples of just subjectivity to the max, because Like what you think is a good PowerPoint or nice design, I may genuinely think is abhorrent. I may really not like the design of your PowerPoint, right? Like I might like it. But anyway, I did a PowerPoint. Someone didn't like it. And so then that PowerPoint and me in their eyes not doing well on a PowerPoint was then a justification for me to be blocked from a variety of different opportunities in very public ways, right? And so it's like, what does it look like to really create objective, safe, equitable spaces for everybody?
Right. And what does it look like for that particular person to admit to themselves that they may not have the corner on how something needs to be done? And I remember, there's just so much, each one of these there's so much to talk, also interconnected. And two things come to mind. I remember Kenneth. So Kenneth was my mentor and my colleague for 12 years, and he died way too early in 2004. But as we were working together, I remember sort of saying to him, because my style, we were both about the same age, and my facilitation style is sometimes to admit I've made a mistake or to show some vulnerability. And I said to Kenneth, you never do that. You never show any vulnerability. Tim, I can't afford to do that. He said, people are watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. So even if I make one, I'm not going to say that I did because people are ready to pounce all over me for it.
Right.
And again, just another example of how long it took me to learn that. He had to sort of say that out loud to me, even though I've been working a while. So, I think there's that part of it. And I have another thought, but I'm sure it'll come to me as we keep talking. So here's the other story, which was that I tend to be the detail-oriented person, and sometimes I'd get really frustrated because I felt like he wasn't paying attention to like airfare or air flights or when we had to be somewhere. And once we both ended up in different airports, and so I started to develop a little bit of an attitude about how I was doing so much more than he was and more important. And we were having a conversation, and he said something to me like, I talked to so-and-so the other day, and I said, so-and-so, they were in our training a year ago. And he went, yeah. You're talking to them now? I said, oh, yeah. And then he proceeded to tell me that he was in relationships with everybody, for most people, in almost all the trainings over time, and that's what he did. And I just was such a light bulb moment for me of like, oh my God, this man, who is a brilliant trainer, there was no question about that, is leading and offering things that I've never even dreamt of being able to lead or offer, that makes such a difference in this work, while I'm sitting here feeling all superior because I know how to schedule a plane flight. So, it was just like, that so many of us, and so many white people in particular, but so many of us are walking around thinking that we know how things should work when we don't know at all. Because we're open to how other ways of doing might actually offer so much more. So, yeah.
Man, I appreciate that. And again, that resonates with me too, because I think about, especially if you have like these majority white organisms, again, like people attract, or they're attracted to people that are like them, right? And that's not just in appearance, but also in like ways of thinking and doing. And so like if you're in a space, the majority are really good at tasks or really good at, things off a box. If there's someone who can do those things, but like that's just not their wiring, then that person's automatically seen as a problem or as inferior in some way. In reality, it's like, okay, there's 8 of y'all who tick off boxes and who are very like transactional. Is it possible for me to be different and at the same time, like be just as good, if not add more value than you do, perhaps? Like, I think for me, transparently, I think one of the biggest mistakes I think I've made in my career is that I think I've been too vulnerable about me wanting to learn and grow, because I say, hey, I'd like to learn this. I don't know this. But what I've learned is in the spirit of perfectionism, when you communicate that you don't know something or you're new to something, I've just learned that Black and white people just don't have the grace to communicate that they don't know. They don't have the grace to grow. They just don't.
Right.
Okay. So.
And it's infuriating. I mean, it's completely infuriating.
It is.
And it's a complete loss it's a complete loss. I mean, I think the thing that I would like to get across is my audience, my commitment is to working with other white people, is for those of us listening to this to understand the deep violence in that. And, working side by side with people who feel like they are not allowed to offer their vulnerability or their desire to grow and learn because we're going to go, oh my God, it's intense. So, yeah.
So you have a lot of terms here. You know, we might have to do a part 2, but I want to see how many of these we can get through. And so I'm going to back up and let you talk more. Sense of urgency.
I think that, again, the point of urgency, so every organization I've ever worked with operates in a huge sense of urgency, and everything is so critically important right this minute. And it completely perpetuates racism because the example I'll give is we were doing work with an organization. We were doing an anti-workshop with an organization of mostly lawyers that do very good work on a statewide level. And they had just sort of unpacked all the ways in which people of color on the staff and in the community that they served were not feeling heard, were not included in decision-making, were not, their ideas were shut down, sort of what we've just been talking about. And an emergency came up. And I think there might have been an arrest or something urgent happened in the community, and the white leadership, the white lawyers felt like they had to respond right this minute. If they didn't respond right this minute, the organization would be at stake. And right in front of our eyes, all of the dynamics that had been named were playing out in front of us. And the two of us who were facilitating the workshop tried to suggest to them, this is happening right in front of our eyes. We know that this does feel urgent, and we suggest that you sit down and you take a breath, and you understand that that there are other people in the community who are handling it in this moment, and that what you all need to do is really sit and take a breath and see how you can approach this differently. And so they just, repeated you could see it. The white people were circled around making all these decisions, and the people of color were ringing them on the outside, trying to listen in and then getting disgusted and walking away. And it was just, things are urgent. If we're not paying attention and we haven't set up the relationships and we haven't set up the procedures to say when things get literally urgent, this is what we're going to do. And feel urgent, but they aren't, this is what we're going to do. And is this really as urgent as we think it is? Because maybe we need to, because it's urgent, we need to take a breath. We need to take a breath and make sure that we're all in this together rather than walking all over each other in our attempt to prove something, which is to prove like we're the organization that's going to respond like that, right, even if the way that we respond, tramples over people. So, and then I think a lot of us internalize urgency. A lot of white people feel like if we don't act right now, if I don't fix this right now, then I'm not going to be able to prove I'm a good white person. And so then we go in and fix something and we make it worse because we haven't stopped to take a breath, to consult with other people, to see if our intuition or our impulse is actually the right one. I've seen that happen over and over and over again.
Let's talk about quantity over quality.
We live in a capitalist society and we love to measure things and we love to believe that value has to do with amounts of things, usually money. And again, so I see some of the funder patterns, I'm just sighing deeply, some of the funder patterns, all the funder patterns that I've seen in my lifetime in work is funders trying to get people to prove that they're effective by the numbers of things. How many people did you impact? Not the quality of things, not the depth of things, not the sustainability of things, but the number of things. It's just such a limited measure of how we're doing. And the research I've done on culture shift shows that it's actually not a numbers game. It's not. We don't need a majority of people to shift culture. We need deep relationships. We need generational change. We need clusters of people coming to new beliefs simultaneously, but they don't have to be a majority. So I just think it's good to be able to have a sense of what we think progress is, but often we aim towards, I do a lot of work in schools, and the story I often tell, so I'm sorry if anybody's heard the story before, how our schools often, if not always, often have a story that what they're trying to do is prepare students for success. And what they mean by that is we want students to stay in school, get good grades, graduate, get a job, and go shopping. And that's sort of and if we can measure that we've done that, it doesn't matter if our students are leading meaningful lives. We're not measuring that. We're not measuring if students know how to find themselves, and we're not measuring if students have gotten in touch with their spiritual side or their artistic side. We're not measuring whether students know how to be in relationship with themselves and with each other. We're not measuring the things that matter. We just don't know how to measure this. We're obsessed with graduation rates and how much money people are making.
You have another one here about worship of the written word. Mm-hmm.
So I'll give an example if you will give an example, but
okay, go ahead.
I mean, this is our history,
Yeah.
sort of the theft of indigenous land, the theft of land from Mexico, the broken treaties, the enslavement of people. It's all built on worship of the written word, and the whole, all of our Southwest and Midwest states that became U.S. property after the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All of that theft of land was made possible because Congress passed all kinds of legislation requiring people to prove ownership, and those people lived in a culture where that's not how people knew that they owned land. So that's just one example, and just the ways that we hide behind, if it's not written down, then it doesn't exist. Only wisdom is if it's written down, and then only if it's written down by certain people. What comes to mind for you?
Well, no, so here's where I found the application interesting. So there's a way that I believe those in power and in the majority will essentially place the burden on the oppressed to have evidence, tangible, documented evidence. But then in the instances where that evidence is undeniable, then at best it simply just saves that oppressed person from being harmed. But it doesn't necessarily guarantee justice for that oppressed person.
No, or they'll say it's not written right, or the form's not filled out correctly,
right? Or well, we still don't have all the facts, or well,
right?
What about the other person's side? And so like, there's still this like it's really like it's such a jig, like because you're gonna lose, but it's just the question just is, while this may have saved you from getting fired, it's not actually going to absolve your name completely. After all, these other people said something, right. It's also. I think about the Pend case where Bhagat Singh Pend sued the Supreme Court for citizenship, and he was from India, and he was suing based on how science classified people from India as Caucasoids. And the year before, a Japanese person who had done the same thing lost the case because people from Japan were classified as Mongoloid, so they were not white. But the Supreme Court said, well, it's true science classifies you as Caucasoid, but you're not seen as white by the common white man, therefore you're not white. So it's a written word, but also the word is, as you said, controlled and considered by those in power, and whose written words will be paid attention to and whose won't. Yeah, I think about Breonna Taylor. Yeah. We know that she was murdered by the state in her own bed. Right. But then when you go back and you look at the report, it's completely blank. Right. And so, anybody with good sense should be able to understand that Breonna Taylor's bullet-ridden body and that piece of paper are not congruent. So, one of those is lying. Breonna's own blood testifies that she is not lying. So, why are Breonna Taylor's murderers still free?
Right.
It's the worship of the written word.
Yeah. Sandra Bland, all of that, yeah.
Yeah, Sandra Bland as well, right, and countless others, Tony McDade, and it's frustrating. But I think about that. I think about how it's just, again, I think about how manipulative, and you use the word pernicious. It's a really appropriate word, isn't that? Documentation really matters until it doesn't. I always tell marginalized people to document everything because, again, while documentation might not ever hold anybody accountable, it at the very least can make sure that you don't get fired, or it can delay you getting fired because you have something hard evidence that, if someone says, well, you did, you're like, well, no, I have this. What you're saying is clearly not true. Okay. So paternalism was another characteristic that you had in your research. Yeah.
I'm going to bow here to a man named Paul Kivel, who does a lot of writing on Christian hegemony. It's just the way in which, and so many of these intersect, and I'm adding one called qualified. I don't know that that's on the list explicitly there, but it's the way in which we'll assume that because we're white, we are qualified to act and make decisions about things that are outside our lived experience. And I think about, when I taught it, when I wasn't on the faculty in educational leadership, and when I taught undergraduate students in education, most of them are young white women who are coming into teaching because they love to do. And please know I admire teachers beyond belief because they work so hard for so little.
Sure.
And yet they come in, these young white women come in very idealistic and very hopeful, and they have no experience, most of them, working with color, and very little preparation for doing that, and yet have not internalized that they're not at all qualified to do the job that they're preparing for. And the education system hasn't internalized that either. And so just the ways in which, I got almost every helping institution is operating out of sense of paternalism, like we know what's better for you without consulting you or asking you about your lived experience. And I think about doing work with the Department of Social Services, where it's about a woman who, in order to make it through her week, had to visit 11 different offices in the Department of Social Services to account for herself. And it's the way in which, if we look at Congress, banks are completely involved in writing policies having to do with banks.
Yeah.
Poor people and working people have no say in policies that impact their lives, and the laws that impact their lives are written by people who think that they need to be punished for being working class and poor, or who think that they need to be exploited, or who think that, who have absolutely no care or concern or lived experience, for the most part, of what it means to be black, brown, working class, poor. And paternalism is just this idea that we know better than you, and it's, it can be very deeply embedded in religious thinking and Christian thinking, and I will admit, I want to make sure I understand there's a lot of liberatory thinking grounded in Christian thinking too. It's just that it's sort of the idea that we know best, we're going to convert you to our ways. And, that's what white supremacy is all about. The goal here is to like us if we can exploit you more that way. Assimilation, and if not assimilation, exploitation and violence. It's all based on this idea that we know better, and one of the things that we know better is that profit's more important than people.
I think that's true. Ultimately, I think it comes down to a lot of power and control, right? And so, one of my larger concerns right now, even as corporations and larger organizations, we're looking at, Black Lives Matter, and people are taking these statements and stances, and organizations are mobilizing their employee resource groups and different things to have these conversations and do real talk and all this kind of stuff. And how much of this is about really hearing and including their marginalized employees, and how much of this is about really making sure that you're retooling, reshaping your organization to be equitable and inclusive, or how much of this is really about you just trying to put some gates and borders around this to maintain control. Right?
Totally.
That's my biggest concern.
Yeah. I think there's two parts to this. So I think there can be conscious paternalism, and then there can be unconscious paternalism, and probably lots of gradations in between. And so I, for one, actually completely hate the terms diversity, and because I don't think that it's about window dressing or table dressing or whatever term you want to use.
Sure.
It doesn't ask the question, what are we including people into? Because if we were to ask that question, we would have to admit that a lot of what we're inviting people into is toxic. And so it's not about including people. It's about reshaping everything. And I think that's what I was talking about in terms of what we need to be wary of in this, is that some of the backlash is going to be very direct and hateful, and a lot of it is going to be about accommodation. And forget about justice. Let's just accommodate. And so I think that paternalism really plays a role, and we can see it reflected in older leaders often, people who've been around a long time, who're scared they're going to lose power by these young people who are coming up full of fervor and demanding justice. And some of us have accommodated for so long in order just to often survive that we've forgotten what the goal is. And some of the paternalism is, and I'll speak for myself, it's sort of the internalized entitlement, internalized belief that I'm to do things I'm not qualified to do. And it didn't require any intent on my part. And, I tell a story on the website, and it might be in the book, I can't remember, of essentially pushing my black colleague aside in an environment where I knew absolutely everything. This is a different colleague named Kamaya Marshuria, another wise and incredible organizer. And he was in the Delta. The room was packed full of African-American people living in the Delta, economically poor, culturally incredibly genius and rich. And, I didn't think he was doing a good job, so I walked up to the front and pushed him aside. And I didn't know anything about organizing in the Delta, right? But I had this instinct in my body that he wasn't doing it, and I needed to fix it. It was and that's so that there's that the way that I internalized this paternalism and this idea that I know how to do things. We just cause so much harm. And again, it's a complete tribute to Kamaya that we're still friends. And he actually didn't say anything to me for years. And then finally I started thinking about it. And I went, Kamaya, what about that day? And he went, oh, I figured you'd figure it out sooner or later.
Wow.
You know, so there were like 5 years in there where Kamaya I was not in genuine relationship with him because he was waiting for me to figure it out. You know, it's just...
To your example, I think about it in ways that so it's interesting. You have these cultures that are very racist, right? Like you have these organizations that have harmed black people for a while. But it just so happens that there's a certain confluence of events that are forcing organizations that have been historically harmful to black and brown people. Now they're having to do things differently. But what's interesting is that some of the same people who just 6 months ago were very harmful are now self-appointing themselves as leaders to have these conversations, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a certain, I think, of course, that's emotionally inauthentic, but I think there's also a certain level of entitlement and paternalism in that.
Yeah, totally. And again, I think,
yeah.
So this is my job. It's not your job. But as someone who identifies as white, who is white, who lives a white life, and who thinks a lot about what it means to be in relationship with other white people, part of what I have is to encourage myself and other white people to think about what are we doing here, and what is the cost to you of this posturing, and what would it be like for you to actually authentically sit down with yourself and go, what am I afraid of? What kind of help do I need? Where do things really need to change? And I think all of us need to develop a much better practice of what I would call radical honesty with ourselves about why we want to live in a world where we actually are able to have authentic relationships with other people and ourselves, and live in a world where people are well cared for and people can thrive, and we don't have to be so afraid of violence and all these other things. So, yeah.
So I'm going to pick one last one. Fear of open conflict.
Yeah. That goes back to perfectionism and some of the other things that we talked about. The story I'll tell is that, well, it's a common story, which is that some racism is happening, and rather than deal with the racism that's happening, we will label or target the person who's naming it, and sometimes that happens to white people too, and because we're so afraid of the truth-telling that's going to happen if we actually talk about how racism is happening. And so it's just this, like, we're too afraid to talk about things that are real and they're going to have emotion attached to them and might lead us as white people to feel like we've done something wrong, or we might essentially be bad in some kind of way. So let's not talk about it. Let's blame the person who's trying to make us uncomfortable. This is attached to right to comfort. Let's blame the people who are calling us in and say that there's something wrong with them, so that we don't have to feel our feelings. We don't have to be uncomfortable. We don't have to look at ourselves, and we can stay in what feels like control. And it's such a again, it's causing such harm both to the other people, and also to ourselves. The ability to sort of say, "Bring it on! Okay, tell me more. Tell me more. And that was so racist. Okay, tell me more. I want to know. Tell me more." Such a different energy. I mean, it's opening. Or, "You're racist." "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." "No, I'm not." There's nowhere. It's like you're building conflict, and you're not. It's like, well, tell me how am I racist? Yeah, I want to know, because I think I probably am. So tell me. There's so much more fruit there. Even if you end up not agreeing with what they say, it's like there's more fruit, more juice, more ability to. It's like we can handle this. We can sit in this discomfort. And in fact, if we don't learn to do that, we're not going to.
But I think though, like in the context of like a business, like the fear with that is that if I admit that I'm racist, if I admit that I've harmed you, then that gives you byway to pursue the company, right? And so like there's this fear of creating risk or opening your company up, opening yourself up to risk by admitting your faults, you know?
So people just figure out a way to deal with that. I mean,
I love how you just dismiss that.
Oh, come on. I mean, I don't, legalese and laws and policies are the service of connection. and not in service of fear and abuse, right? It's like Trump saying, you can only come to the thing if you're not going to sue me for getting the corona. Like, no. And I would also say, for me, so one of the racial equity principles that, you'll see this list of characteristics, and you'll also see our racial equity principles. And one of them, and one of the ones I love the most, is called organizing mind. And what we mean by that is you start with the chorus. People, oh, you're preaching to the chorus. I go, yes, we do, because our chorus is very out of tune. So let's get in tune, and then we can start preaching to people outside the chorus and bring them into the chorus. So it's like, start with the people who want what you want, and figure out what your power is, figure out what the risks are that you're willing to take. There, each one, reach one, teach one, as Sharon Martinez would say. And so in a corporate environment, it's like figuring out what are the roadblocks that we need to get rid of so that we can actually do this, or where are we willing to have authentic conversation regardless of the risk? And can we start doing that? So it's like, figure out what's in your power to do and do it. You don't wait for permission. Don't wait for, it's like there are lots of things that we can do and build our power that way, people to give us permission to do it.
I love it.
As we are witnessing across the country and across the globe, right? All these beautiful people, many young people, not waiting for permission.
I love it.
Bring down statues, cut off Columbus's head, and
it's brought me joy, frankly, to see.
Beautiful thing to see right now.
It is. Yeah. It is. Dr. Okun, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I just want to thank you so much. And I guess I want to make sure everybody knows that the document that we were walking through and that I picked a few characteristics out of for our guests to want to beautifully expound upon is going to be in the show notes, and we're going to also be promoting it. You'll see it this week as social media and things of that nature. So make sure that you check it out. This has been Living Corporate. We do this every single week. We're having conversations, real talk in the corporate world that center and amplify marginalized voices at work. We'll make sure you catch you all next time. In the meantime, between now and next time, we're all over Beyonce's internet. You just type in Living Corporate, we'll pop up. We'll catch us on Instagram at Living Corporate. And man, if you have anything you want to talk to us about, just contact us through the website, living-corporate.com. Please say the dash, living-corporate.com. Till next time, y'all, it's been Zach, and you've been listening to Dr. Tema Okun, activist, educator, speaker, organizer. Peace.
Living Corporate is a podcast by Living Corporate LLC. Our logo was designed by David Dawkins. Our theme music was produced by Ken Brown. Additional music production by Antoine Franklin for Musical Elevation. Post-production is handled by Jeremy Jackson. Got a topic suggestion? Email us at livingcorporatepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us online on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and living-corporate.com. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned.